Inside Utah Politics, judging the judges. Several judges will be up for attention on the November ballot. How a local commission is doing the homework to help you make an informed decision. And the Federal Aviation Administration addressing flight attendant fatigue. The proposal to add extra downtime and reaction.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. We do begin this morning with Jennifer Yim. She is the Executive Director of the Judicial Performance Evaluation Commission. Jennifer, great to have you back on the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to shorten up this name and just call it JPEG for the purposes of this conversation. First off, explain exactly what JPEG is.
JPEG is an independent state government evaluation commission designed to help voters have the information that they need to cast informed ballots in November. Hard to know how to vote on judges because thankfully most of us aren't in court. And so gives some comparisons and gives some sense of how they do on a number of different factors.
Yeah, I think we all go through the ballot, get to those judges, and then say what, who, why, because unless there's really something controversial involving that judge, you just don't really hear much about them.
It's true, and the system is, intentionally designed so that it's based on merit and not partisanship or campaign dollars or, issues. But we want people to be able to have the information that they need to cast informed votes so that they can be the check on our system.
JPEC made up, as you mentioned, of commissioners. Talk about first who they are. Who are these commissioners that make up this commission?
They're a diverse group of Utahns who volunteer their time to evaluate the performance of judges. They're appointed by the separate branches of government and come together. About half of them are lawyers. There's partisan balance, although we're not a partisan process. And they spend an incredible amount of time learning about our judiciary and helping to make informed decisions.
How do they go about doing that? How do they come up with their assessments?
So as staff to the commission, I coordinate a process of surveying people with experience in courts across the state, as well as sending anonymous courtroom observers into courts to watch what they do, and then of course we collect metrics.
Talk about the criteria by which the judges are graded based on this.
Yes, so we look at their legal skills, of course. We also look at, especially helpful in the era of COVID, look at their administrative skills, so their ability to handle the technology. We look at how they treat people in court, something we call procedural fairness, and we look at their integrity and their judicial temperament.
Okay, and then all these things go into this report that the commission does what with?
They take a look at the performance of every judge in the state, and they make recommendations about how a judge does with each other, in the end casting votes to determine whether the judge passes minimum performance standards or fails to pass them.
And this is a little different than in years past. I've had you on the show quite a bit to talk about this when the election rolls around. And it used to be that your commission would basically straight up, yes or no, recommend retaining a certain judge. But it's different. Talk about how it's different. You've already mentioned a little bit, but go a little deeper. And why the change?
This last legislative session, JPEC and the Utah legislature talked about this process. And what we decided was it was really important for voters to be making these decisions. We wanted voters to have the information that they need, but we didn't want to presume that voters should cast votes in the way that the commission felt like it should, or the opposite. We want them to make up their own minds. So as government, it's our job to provide the information, independent, nonpartisan information, and then let the voters make choices.
I went to the website just to take a look at how it works, pulled up just Salt Lake County to try to get a feel for how it looks and the information that's displayed there. The percentage was a big part of that, but explain what that means, because I saw percentages anywhere from, say, 60 to 90%. So explain what that means and what is a typical percentage, and if it falls below that, how should viewers or voters assess that?
That's a great question. We do surveys of all kinds of different folks who are before judges, and we look at their sense of whether or not a judge should be retained in their view. And then we look at those averages, and for most levels of court, that average percent recommending retention is usually around 88, 90%. So someone who gets 60% of survey respondents recommending retention, it's a pretty significant difference. And that might suggest to voters that they want to take extra care. The commission may still find that they meet minimum performance standards, but in the end, the information is there for voters to make up their minds.
And it could be a number of reasons, as you've already mentioned, based on the criteria as to why a judge might get a lower score.
Absolutely. It could be, it's the sort of end point question in our survey. And so given all of the ways they rate the judge on all the different metrics, in the end we ask them, so do you think this judge should be retained and why?
Okay. If I remember right, there are 13 commissioners?
Correct.
Okay, so basically that percentage is based on the 13 commissioners and how they recommend as far as retention goes. Is that correct?
The percent recommending retention is actually not the commissioners. We're giving the voters a sense of how the people we surveyed felt. So you have two sort of measures. You have the vote of the commission, and then you have the percent of survey respondents recommending retention.
So that's a combination of the two.
Yep, so you have both of those on that first page that you ended up at.
Okay, I've lived in several states, and to my knowledge, this is the only state that I've covered elections in where this service is provided. So talk about why in the state of Utah we go through this process to evaluate the judges.
We're actually really lucky here in the state of Utah, and the more I do this, the more I recognize why that is. But in other states, as you may know, you would be very likely to see campaign signs and speeches made by judges who are running for a contested partisan election. And they collect money from donors. They make issue-based promises. And it's, you know, it's how might we feel if we were in court and we recognized that our attorney hadn't made a contribution to the judge, but the opposing attorney had made a contribution to the judge's campaign and then went on to win. I think that that dynamic, which we are able to keep out of the Utah judiciary by focusing instead on merit instead of money, is a real plus.
I imagine you have a chance to talk to judges about the process. What do you hear from them in general? Do they like this? I guess it probably depends on the score ultimately, but what, by and large, do you hear from them?
By and large, I think that judges appreciate the feedback that they get because they are interested in being the best judges that they can be. They take their jobs very seriously, and they have a lot of influence in our lives. So the fact that they can get honest, credible feedback from people who actually have experience with them in court makes a lot of difference to them, and they can use that to improve.
All right, last real quick, where can viewers go to find all this information on these assessments?
Thank you. It's at judges.utah.gov.
Okay, very easy. Appreciate your insight, and interesting that we have a change in the process this year. Glad to have you here and explain that. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Still to come, the U.S. Supreme Court is back in session, and on day one, the justice is declining to take up a lawsuit from a gun rights group from right here in Utah. Our panel debates that a little bit later. But first, a major investment in chip manufacturing here in the United States, how it will address the shortage after the break. Flight attendants will soon get more mandated rest time between flights. During the week, the Federal Aviation Administration announcing a new rule that would boost the required rest time from 9 consecutive hours to 10 hours. Washington correspondent Anna Warnicki with the details.
The FAA says flight attendants are now guaranteed more rest between flights.
I signed the paperwork that increases rest period for flight attendants to 10 consecutive hours, no exception.
Under the rule, flight attendants are now entitled to a minimum rest period of at least 10 consecutive hours between shifts. That's 1 more hour than the previous requirement.
Acting Administrator Billy Nolan says a well-rested crew can mean the difference between life and death.
Everyone knows about the landing of U.S. Airways 1549 on the Hudson River. There were actually 2 miracles on the Hudson that day. First was landing the plane. The second, but just as important, was the flight attendants who got the passengers off the plane and kept them safe throughout the entire event.
And Sarah Nelson, the head of the largest flight attendants union, says the rule is long overdue, especially at a time when flight crews are already stretched thin.
Longer days, shorter nights, with the reduction in schedules throughout this pandemic, and also all of the combative passengers that they have had to face on not enough rest. Today, that is getting corrected.
The FAA says airlines have 90 days to implement the new rule. In Washington, I'm Anna Warnicki.
The chip manufacturing industry in the U.S. is about to get a major boost. Micron announcing it will invest up to $100 billion in a new plant in New York to help fix future chip shortages. Washington correspondent Rashad Hudson reports on what this means for the rest of the country.
Micron is walking in from the cornfields to play ball in White Pine.
The Idaho-based computer chip maker Micron says it will spend $20 billion building a new facility in Syracuse, New York. Tuesday, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer celebrated the announcement that the company could invest up to $100 billion in the state over the next 2 decades.
This is the largest private investment in New York history and probably in the nation.
Schumer says building more chip factories in the U.S. will help reduce dependence on Asian suppliers and prevent more chip shortages.
We will bring these jobs back to our shores.
These chips will supply cell phones, data centers, and electric vehicles. As many as 50,000 jobs could be created in the surrounding area. Micron's investment comes 2 months after the CHIPS and Science Act was signed into law, providing $52 billion to boost domestic semiconductor production.
And that sends a strong signal to investors like Micron to get into the game.
Jared Bernstein with the Council of Economic Advisors says Micron's announcement is a direct result of the CHIPS Act.
Manufacturing used to be prominent in this part of the country, and it can and will be again.
The Biden administration says they expect more companies to make investments like this across the country. Reporting in Washington, Rashad Hudson.
Coming up, banning books in schools. Porter's hosting a town hall calling on districts to follow the law. Our panel weighs in after the break. Time now to debate some of the big stories of the week with the Inside Utah Politics panel. This week we have State Representatives Corey Malloy and Carol Spackman-Moss. Great to have both of you on the show. Let's get right into the first topic, and that is SCOTUS back in session. Representative Spackman-Moss, let's start with you. Coming off a term with some very controversial rulings as SCOTUS gets back to work, how are Democrats feeling in general as this new term begins?
I think many Democrats are concerned about the upcoming issues that they might be dealing with because they could take away rights that people have had for many, many years. And one of them has to do with racial makeup of colleges like Harvard, North Carolina, and reconsidering what has been known as affirmative action. So that's one they're concerned about. The other one is taking away rights from LGBTQ individuals.
All right, we'll dig into those a little bit more in just a second, but first, Representative Malloy, how are Republicans feeling as this new term gets underway?
Well, I think overall, I think Republicans are okay with the makeup of the court, and I think a lot of the issues that the court will be looking at are going to be looked at the way our justices have looked at them, and hopefully they'll do their job and do it well and have the integrity that's always been on the court. And I know there's concerns with some of the makeup and things like that, but we always need to remember too that the court is made up of appointed justices from the President of the United States, whoever the president is at the time, and they have a job to do, and they're not elected officials, so we need to remember to try and keep the politics out of the court, I think, and just respect the process and respect the justices.
One interesting thing that happened right at the get-go on day one, the justices declining to take up a lawsuit from Utah Shooting Sports Council and Clark Opposition to overturn the federal ban on bump stocks. Representative Spackman-Moss, what do you make of that move from the Supreme Court?
Well, I was pleased that they declined to take up that case, and I can't believe that we'd want to ban. That ban was done during the Trump administration. In fact, it was something President Trump said he was going to do. And when the man in Las Vegas shot 1,000 rounds in 10 minutes, killing 58 people, I don't see how a person of conscience could think that that device would be a good thing for the general public to have.
As pointed out, this was a Trump-era executive order. Representative Malloy, your thoughts on how the court essentially ruled on this?
Well, I think overall it's disappointing. It had been going through the process to come before the Supreme Court for a few years, and then it was dropped. But I think that's the prerogative of the court. They dropped a lot of other cases as well. And I think the bump stocks aside, it leads to a much broader issue, and that is the rulemaking of the executive branch when they do executive orders, as well as some of our federal agencies who decide to create rules and enforce rules that are not necessarily put in place by the legislature. So I think that's a bigger issue, and I think down the road we're going to see that come up in other areas besides, potentially this one versus others. So.
All right, Representative Spackman-Moss, you already alluded to two of the big issues you will be watching in affirmative action and LGBTQ plus rights. What's at stake here as this new term is now officially underway?
One that I didn't mention has to do with elections being handled exclusively by the states, election rights. And this is a big concern too, because I think it gives states more ability to gerrymander, and that's a concerning thing. So I'll be looking at particularly things related to elections, and there's another one about people of color, particularly black individuals whose district may no longer be able to have a minority congressional district, and this is likely to disenfranchise a lot of minority people.
Representative Malloy, what are some other big issues you are specifically keeping an eye on?
I think the issues related to the EPA that they're going to be looking at, and some of these other issues, redistricting is one. I think these are all fair topics for the Supreme Court to look at when they come before the Supreme Court. And that's the role of the Supreme Court, is to look at these things and see if they are constitutional or not, and make sure all the rights of all people are protected as it relates to the Constitution of the United States as determined by the Supreme Court.
All right, both of you brought up redistricting, so let's dig into that a little bit more. What would you like to see the court do and why? Representative Spackman-Moss.
I don't know specifically what they could do, but it would certainly be a benefit for Utah to have some more requirements. For example, right in my new district in Mill Creek, the corner of 39th South and 900 East is the convergence of the 4 congressional districts. Call it the 4 corners. So you could walk across the street to each corner in Mill Creek and you'd be in a different congressional district. Now, I think this is an example of gerrymandering, to cut up the most populous county and to take away the voice of the one county that has the most Democrats.
Representative Moy, what would you like to see happen in this arena?
Well, I'd like to see some of these cases that are going before the court determined if they followed the law and followed the Constitution of the United States. I think over the history of this country and this state as well, and in other states, you see both sides. It's like, that's gerrymandering, that's gerrymandering. Well, I think if it is, then it's against the law. If it's not, then it's not. And we have redistricting for a purpose, and so we have to go through it every 10 years. And then the lawsuits happen where people think that there has been gerrymandering. And if it goes to the Supreme Court's going to decide those cases, and which will set a precedent for moving forward in the future. So I think it will be good for the Supreme Court to decide what is right and what is not right based on some of these lawsuits that they're going to be listening to.
All right, a hot topic during the week was the banning of books at local schools. Representative Ken Ivory hosting a town hall during the week that we attended and reported on, talking about how the law is being implemented, and in the way they see it, districts that are not in compliance. But this all has to do with sensitive materials. Representative Spackman-Moss, first off, your thoughts on this law and how it's being implemented.
Well, this strikes at the very heart of who I am. I taught English, literature, and writing for over 30 years, high school students. So any attempts to ban books that have been part of the curriculum or even outside reading in the case of my class really strikes at the heart of censorship that I think is dangerous, and it's a slippery slope. And when Representative Ivory talks about districts not being in compliance, I don't know what he means by that, because there's a process that bill set up for review. And this is, his assurance to me was this bill would only look at books in school libraries. And I know it's well-intentioned on the part of many parents to have books that are age appropriate in the school library. But it didn't say a parent could complain and then the book is automatically withdrawn from the shelves. That is not how that is supposed to work. And that's what I thought he was implying. These districts, he said some books should just be taken off the shelves, no discussion. Well, to take a book, a passage out of context and not look at the entire book, this is the work of a professional librarian, just as I was a professional teacher, and look at literature as a whole and not individual passages that somebody might find a line or two they object to. This is a very big concern to me and many other teachers that we're going down this road. It's like something back in the 50s, I guess, that I used to read about.
All right, Representative Malloy, your thoughts on this law and how it's being implemented?
Well, I think we're talking about insensitive materials that are not age appropriate, and even pornography. And I've seen some of the materials. It's not just passages that people see in passing. They are graphic images and drawings and that show just graphic pornography. And there's no other way to talk about it. And I don't think those should be in our schools. And so we're not talking about banning books or book burning or removing books, but we're talking about removing insensitive, un-age-appropriate content that falls within the confines of insensitive and even graphic pornographic materials. And I've seen some of those, and they are very graphic.
All right.
And so I don't think that has an appropriate place in our schools.
I should have saved more time for this conversation. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but very important insights. Appreciate both of you being here. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break. We leave you now to look at what's on the radar in the world of politics. The midterm election is next month. Mail-in ballots will start to go out the week of October 17th. Election day is Tuesday, November 8th. Same-day voter registration is available at the polls on Election Day. Thanks so much for making us part of your Sunday morning. We hope to see you again next week as we go inside Utah politics.